Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. There was a wonderful poster session that ended just a few moments ago, and I know people are trickling in, but we wanted to welcome you to day 2 of the Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference in 2022. I want to start by acknowledging the ancestral Lenape homelands on which New York University stands, and the longstanding significance of these lands for the Lenape nations past and present. I also want to acknowledge that with our conference distributed across the globe, many others are joining us from the traditional lands of other indigenous peoples, and I invite you to find out who these peoples are if you do not know already, and to acknowledge them yourselves. I have the great honor and pleasure today to introduce you to our second keynote speaker, Catherine D'Ignazio. She is an assistant professor of urban science and planning at MIT, also the director of the Data and Feminism Lab, which uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial equity, particularly as they relate to space and place. Professor D'Ignazio is a scholar, artist, designer, and hacker mama who focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement. With Raul Barva, she built the platform databasic.io, a suite of tools and activities to introduce newcomers to data science. Her 2020 book from MIT Press, Data Feminism, co-authored with Lauren Klein, which, by the way, is a really great read that I highly recommend those of you who get excited by her talk today to pick up, charts a course for more ethical and empowering data science practices. This is something of pressing importance in the world today and of particular relevance to learning analytics overall, as well as to our conference theme. Thus, without further ado, I'm very pleased to give you Catherine D'Ignazio.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, for that generous introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here with all of you today, to the whole conference. I'm really grateful to share this space with you. So yeah, I really appreciate the land acknowledgement, and I just want to add that I'm coming in from the unceded lands of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts people. And I also want to acknowledge that MIT, my home institution, not only occupies stolen land, but it has also profited from the sale of federal lands granted by the Morrill Act in the 1800s. And so these were territories that were stolen from 82 tribes, including the Greater and Little Osage, Chippewa, and the Omaha peoples. And so it's the conversation that the administration has taken up, us in the broader community have taken up, and it's really only just begun is how I would characterize it. And I just want to take a moment here to acknowledge the work of Dr. David Shane Lowry, who is a distinguished fellow in Native American Studies at MIT. He's really been stewarding this conversation on our own campus. So I am going to start, and this talk today is going to explore the question that you see on the slide right here. This question, what does feminist data science look like? So the answer to this question starts with the book that Alyssa referenced that I've co-authored with Lauren Klein. And here I also want to take a second to acknowledge her. She's really she's a phenomenal researcher, literary scholar, really path-breaking work in digital humanities and in applying quantitative and computational methods to humanities historical archives. She directs the Digital Humanities Lab at Emory University. So I would encourage everyone to go out, follow her, check out her work. Super interesting work. And one important thing to say about Data Feminism, the book, is that it is open access. And so we love when people buy the book, and it is a really beautiful book, and it has lots of nice color images and visualizations, but it's also available for free if you go to datafeminism.io and there's a big red button that says read the book, and that will take you to the open access version of it online. So what I want to talk about today, I'm going to briefly summarize the book's motivation, sort of how do we come to write a book combining data and feminism. And then I want to move on to a set of examples of work that illustrates data feminism in action. And this includes one of my own kind of ongoing projects, unfinished work, work in progress, where I'm myself sort of trying to enact the principles that we outline in data feminism as we do participatory tech design, tool development for human rights defenders, and so on. And so that's one of the things that I've sort of gone on to explore since the book was published in spring 2020. So it actually came out, we had our launch party, got shut down. It was the first day of the COVID shutdown. It was our book launch party. So I kind of like mark in my mind, it's like data feminism comes out right as the pandemic comes out. Okay, so to jump in, the motivating premise of data feminism is that in the world today, data is, or data are, depending on how you like it, a tremendous form of power. And when we say that, we mean that in a kind of very material sense. So if we look at who are the companies that are making the most money right now, these are the companies that have the capabilities of collecting, storing, cleaning, analyzing, deploying very large amounts of data. And so just like when we say power, we do mean privilege and oppression, but we also mean like kind of just tangible money. And so on the one hand, data science has been used for tremendous benefit. So to advance medical discoveries, to curtail misinformation online. But as we've been seeing, I would say in the past couple of years especially, but in the past decade, it's really been, this work has really been growing. We've also seen significant harms from data-driven systems. So just to give some examples that are discussed in the books that you see here, these are things like face detection systems that cannot see women of color, or that are used to wrongly target Black men and arrest them for crimes they did not commit. These are things like hiring algorithms that demote women applicants. These are things like child abuse detection algorithms that punish poor parents and more. And the work that's here at the bottom of the screen was some of the work that we were drawing from as we were writing data feminism that was very inspirational for us, authors who are really interrogating kind of what are the roots, grounding in structural inequality, what are these roots of structural inequality that are then producing biased data sets, data systems, and algorithms. And these examples of harms just keep coming, and we keep seeing these, coming out in the popular press almost every week. There's some example of some new system that is sort of harmful in different ways. And then we also see this reported on in the popular press with this, kind of like, hopefully this is going away, but, it's like, whoa, the surprise of like, whoa, how could this be? Like the algorithm is biased. How could a computer discriminate? Or how could an algorithm be racist? And this is partially what motivated us to write the book, is to help folks kind of take a step back from this knee-jerk reaction of like, what? Like data are neutral, algorithms are neutral, and start to understand some of the more structural and root causes behind these things. So the main point is this. So data are incredibly powerful, but that power is wielded unequally. And it's also wielded by a small and homogenous group of corporations and other well-resourced institutions. They are the ones who have the resources to design and deploy these data systems for profit, generally speaking. And typically this comes at the expense of actually the majority of everybody else. And so Lauren and I are not the first ones to have made the case that this kind of inequality in data is real, that it's ongoing, and it's necessary to dismantle. But our contribution, what we sort of bring to this conversation, is what intersectional feminism has to offer us in thinking about these questions around data and power. Because intersectional feminism in particular has been focused on these questions of power for a very long time. It has focused on imbalances of power, analyzing structural privilege and oppression, both historically and presently, and analyzing the forces that maintain systems of domination that sort of keep the status quo in place, as well as the kind of responses that we can make to help liberate all of us from these systems of domination. So in other words, while we may be new to evidence of sort of AI harms, we might be, surprised, or the popular press at least is surprised to discover biases in training data that result in sexist or racist or otherwise sort of discriminatory systems. The basic idea that systems are optimized for certain groups and not for others, this is not a new insight for feminists who have long studied unequal systems of power. Right now, we're just talking about, how do those manifest in technology? But so when Lauren and I do this talk, we like to do some basic level setting about, kind of what are we, Lauren and Catherine, talking about when we are bringing feminism into this conversation. And so in the book, we talk about 3 related definitions of the terms. So first, feminism at its core is a belief. And it is the belief that there should be equal rights for all genders. And so if you are somebody who believes in equal rights for all genders, this is the feminist belief. This is a kind of core feminist assertion, is that the genders are all equal. But if you take a look around you, you realize that this world where all genders are equal, this world has not yet been realized. And that's evident in so many ways, from data-driven ways to anecdotal ways. And so we haven't realized that world. So feminism implies a commitment to realizing that belief in the world. So it's a commitment to political action. And then thirdly and finally, feminism also comprises an intellectual heritage. And I think this part is particularly exciting because what it means is that we inherit the knowledge of people who came before us, who have long thought about unequal systems of power and how to address them. And so it's a set of theories and ideas that have come from both inside the academy and outside the academy that help us to understand and challenge unequal power. So we don't have to, there's this kind of like presentist focus of a lot of data and technology worlds, like we're living in this sort of exceptional moment. But in fact, everything that we do today is inherited from so many decades and centuries before us. So how do we draw from this knowledge that comes from the past, whether recent or really far in the past, to inform the work of today? And here feminism has a lot to offer us. And so this brings us around to the idea of intersectional feminism, which you may or may not be familiar with, so I'll introduce it here. So this is a term, this intersectionality is a term that comes to us from the work of women of color feminists and from Black feminists in the US in particular. And here at its core, intersectional feminism is concerned with questions of power. And so these are concepts like the Combahee River Collective, who's from my hometown here in Boston. They, in the 70s, formulated this idea of interlocking systems of oppression to describe the racism, sexism, and heterosexism that they faced as Black, mostly lesbian women. And these sort of oppressions that they faced could not necessarily be disentangled from each other to say, well, this thing that I experienced, that's just sexism, but that one over here, well, that one is racism, And this comes to us through Kimberly Crenshaw's term, which she coined in the 1980s, this term of intersectionality. It continues today with Patricia Hill Collins' work. Patricia Hill Collins is a sociologist who's gone on to really develop further theories of intersectionality and also ideas of the matrix of domination. These give us frameworks to structure critiques of power. So reasons why some groups experience oppression on the one hand or privilege on the other. And this intersection and intersectionality is a very spatial metaphor. And it comes from Kimberly Crenshaw saying that as a Black woman, and she's a legal scholar working in particular with Black women, looking at the kinds of oppressions and discrimination they face, it is not possible to isolate on like one axis certain forces of privilege or oppression from others. So things that like sexism, racism, colonialism interlock and intersect with each other in ways that are impossible to separate, and in ways that compound their effects, and sometimes in non-linear ways. So like the main takeaway here is intersectional feminism. A lot of us inherit, if you're coming as a newcomer to feminism, you may be like, oh yeah, that's for women, or that's about women. But in fact, intersectional feminism is not only about women. It's not even only about gender. It's really about power. Who has power? Who doesn't have power? And again, like we said, data in today's world, data is power in this kind of very sort of material way. And so then the basic idea that we assert in the book is that intersectional feminism, when it's applied to data science, can help challenge and change the unequal balance of power in the world. So to say it another way, data science really needs feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to overturn these power imbalances. Or otherwise said, we often in kind of like data and tech communities, we often talk about, data for good or social tech for good. But what do we mean by good, right? I would argue that the good here is shifting inequality to be less unequal, and in fact to work towards liberation. And so that means really thinking through what are the ways in which we can destabilize and shift the status quo, which is an unequal status quo. So what we do in data feminism is we, as we were writing the book, we looked across many different fields of feminist work. One of the great, like I've said, one of the great things about feminist work is that we have this whole intellectual heritage. And so once, you start looking, there's feminist work in almost every field. It is sometimes very marginalized, but there's feminist economics, there's feminist political scientists, there's of course much feminism in the arts and humanities, there's feminist human-computer interaction, geography, cartography, digital humanities, and so on. And in particular, we looked at fields where folks were trying to really like apply feminism. So to say, well, like, how do we do feminist economics, or how do we do feminist human-computer interaction? And so from this scan, what we did is then distilled these 7 principles of data feminism. So these would be for us, and this are not comprehensive. This is what we came up with from that scan. And so it's very conceivable that there would be other principles or modified principles. But these are principles for doing a kind of more ethical and equitable data science. And I'm not going to have time to go through each of these today in the talk, but maybe the one thing I'll say here is that this is the way that the book is structured. So in fact, there's 7 chapters in the book. Each chapter of the book takes on one of these principles. It tries to explain sort of why we came to that principle and who are the feminist thinkers that led us to formulate that principle. And then it also tries to introduce examples of people in the world who are kind of enacting that principle. So people who are using data science to examine power, or people who are working with data to rethink binaries and hierarchies and so on. And as we were writing the book, we really tried to make this very accessible. Like the goal here was to not assume people have any background either with data science or necessarily with feminism, because this is a real, I would characterize it as a real gap in our technical programs, worlds like statistics, computer science, mathematics. We don't teach feminism and gender studies. We don't teach critical race studies. We don't teach indigenous and ethnic studies. So these are real gaps in the knowledge of folks who have been technically trained. And as we do create more and more systems at the intersection of social and political life, human health, wellness, welfare, all of these areas, intersecting with data, these are areas of expertise that we need to bring together, basically. So here with the principles, the goal was to operationalize feminism for data science at some level. So to try to provide this clear, yet still kind of abstract set of principles for people who are working with data, who want to work with data, or even with people who want to refuse to work with data. So from here, I'm gonna shift into showing you some examples of the work that we feature in the book and some examples of these principles sort of in action. And I'll also be talking about my own recent work to try to kind of do the principles. And one last thing I'm going to say on this slide is you will note that the first principle is examine power. The second principle is challenge power. This is because, like I said, this idea of power, or you could also say this structural inequality, this is what is at the heart of the kind of feminist position, I guess I would say, is this idea that we live in a world characterized by structural inequality. We have to work to understand that, and we also have to work to challenge that. So that's why there's sort of 2 chapters about power. It goes back to the centrality of power. Okay, so this first example has to do, we feature this in the first chapter, and has to do with the principle of examining power, sort of understanding better how systems work. So we talk about projects like Mimi Onuwoha's Library of Missing Data Sets, which you can see here. So Mimi Onuwoha is actually an artist. She's also a writer, but this particular project is an art project. And it's displayed in 2 ways. So it's a simple list in GitHub. It's a GitHub repository. And it lists what she calls missing data sets. And so these are data sets that are, one would think that they were collected by some entity, some agency, but in fact, we don't have systematic or comprehensive data on those things. So these include things like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, or people excluded from public housing because of criminal records. This was created before COVID, but there's also, we can think about the ways that COVID had such disparate impacts across social groups, and for some time at the beginning especially, we were failing to track gender and racialized differences. So the second way you encounter this artwork is as this physical installation, which you see here. So she installed it as this white filing cabinet. You can go up to it in the gallery, and you can actually page through these files. And at the top of each file is the name of the missing data set, or more likely, the description. And you can actually pull out the file folder, open it up. But of course, when you open it up, there's nothing inside because we have no records about that particular issue. The data sets are physically missing. And so the point that she's trying to make here is that these data sets are missing for a reason. And the reason is this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. So this imbalance of power is what determines which data are collected, which data are not collected, what research is conducted, what research is not conducted. And it's worth thinking about who has this power. Governments have this power, moneyed institutions have this power, minoritized groups generally do not. And so she's calling attention to this idea of even what we have records about and what we don't have records about is a political decision. So a lot of times these days we're talking about bias in existing data sets, or we're talking about bias in algorithms, the ways that data are processed or output or rendered for some kind of human decision making. But in fact, she's calling attention to this idea that the bias, in fact, starts much earlier in the pipeline when some institution determines what is worthy of having knowledge about, of having information about, and what things are left out of that equation. And so this is why a feminist approach to data science begins with an analysis of power, because far too often the data sets that we can access, and in turn the questions that they prompt have already been affected by this imbalance of power in the world. So another case, in fact, of missing data sets is this one, which we talk about in the second chapter, which is about challenging power. And in the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero, who's a Mexican citizen. And she resolved to head straight towards the problem of missing data and simply collect it herself. And the data in question here have to do with feminicide, which for those of you who don't know what that is, these are gender-related killings of women and girls. They include cis and trans women. They are legally defined as a crime. There's legislation about feminicide actually in almost all Latin American countries now. However, the state does not systematically collect data on feminicide. And so frustrated by this lack of formal action, Maria Salguero started collecting feminicide data in 2016 and has continued to the present. And she has ended up single-handedly compiling the largest public archive of feminicide in the Mexican context. And the way that this works is she spends around 2 to 4 hours per day on a volunteer basis, logging these feminicides on a Google map that you see here that she calls from media reports. Now she's actually become quite famous, so she has an extensive network of people that send her cases as well. And so she's helped families locate loved ones. She's provided her data to journalists and NGOs. She's actually ended up testifying in front of Mexico's Congress several times. And so in the book, we talk about this as what you might call feminist counter data. So this idea of counter data is a kind of activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And so this idea of counter data represents one way to use data to challenge power. Now, there's a very important caveat to this idea, which is that, for any given social problem, we are not saying that the answer to that problem is to go out and collect more data. So we can imagine that there are many particularly minoritized groups in the world that if we are going to go out and generate more data about those groups, that runs the risk of making them targets from folks that want to, locate them, harm them, stigmatize them, and so on. So it's important to keep in mind that all of these ways of challenging power are not kind of like abstract universal rules. They're contextual sort of pathways to think about. Nevertheless, this is sort of where we start going into the work that I'm doing right now. One of the things that I found after I had interviewed Maria Salguero for Data Feminism and started meeting more people working in this space is that her work is not alone. I mean, she's a really exceptional individual that is collecting counter data about feminicide. But in fact, there are many grassroots efforts that are producing data about gender-related killings and monitoring cases. This is a kind of a human rights defense work, and this work is happening in Latin America, where this conversation about feminicide is really strong right now, but also happening here in North America, Canada as well. And so one of the things that started happening is meeting some more of these groups that are collecting and producing counter data about human rights violations of various kinds. And this led us to assemble what's now a very large-scale participatory action research project. And I just want to recognize that there's a lot of people involved in this project. I have 2 really amazing co-leads, both based in Latin America, Silvana Fumega and Elena Suarez-Val, a great partner, Rahul Bhargav at Northeastern, and then many students who have been contributing to this work. And so here what we're doing is multifold. It's a qualitative research project where we've been interviewing activists like Maria Salguero. So it's both activist groups, NGOs, and civil society organizations that are producing data about gender-related violence. So to understand how they're producing their counter data, what their counter data are used for, and so on. It's also a global community of practice, because one of the things we learned very quickly from groups working on this, on these topics, is they want to meet each other and come together. So we've been creating events and opportunities for folks to meet each other. But thirdly, and the part that I'm going to focus on for the purposes of this talk, it's also a participatory design project to co-design digital tools to support the work of these groups that monitor feminicide, but other forms of gender-related human rights violations. And this is where we come into this intersection with embracing pluralism, which is one of the principles of data feminism, which I'll come back to in a second. So I just want to show you a couple of the tools that we've designed. So we've been working in collaboration with two groups initially. So we worked with one group in the United States and one group in Latin America, and ran a number of different kind of participatory design brainstorming sessions. And this was specifically to think about what are digital data-driven tools that can help support your work. So I just want to be very clear, we as the Data Plus Feminism Lab, we're not trying to like get all the activist data and like analyze it. The way that we see our role is that we are working with them to understand how they're collecting data and to think about ways that digital tools might support and streamline their process. So we're not taking their data. We're designing tools to support their data and informatic practices. And so one of the tools that emerged from this process is this very simple browser extension. Many of these groups, like Maria Salguero, monitor human rights violations and feminicide from news reports. And so it's a very simple called the data highlighter, where as you know, so they might be scanning hundreds of news articles a day to try to extract details about particular cases. And so this browser extension highlights entities on a page to facilitate scanning, and then has a way that you can input custom words that they may be looking for, and it will highlight those as well. So really just a tool to support that kind of scanning process. The second tool that emerged from these co-design sessions is a more complex tool, and has also, you know, in the Q&A we can come back to, there's some interesting issues we ran into along the lines of intersectional feminicide monitoring. So groups that are looking for both race and gender from news articles. So this ran into some interesting issues there that we can come back to. But this is a system very similar to Google Alerts. So one of the things that's really impressive about the work that these civil society organizations do is that they're monitoring a tremendous amount of information. So if you think about Maria Salguero is monitoring, trying to capture all cases of gender-related killing that happen in Mexico, a huge territory. So often needing to scan many different media sources to both discover cases, detect cases, and also to like extract information about those cases for her database. And so what we've done with the activists is design a tool very similar to Google Alerts, which actually many groups actually use Google Alerts, but actually many stopped using Google Alerts because it was giving them many irrelevant results. So we kind of created an alerting system tailored to detecting gender-related violence. And so the way that works is the system is set up, the activists have their kind of existing query that they want to query against media in their country. Each day the system goes out, gets the list of media articles that meet those criteria. It then runs those through a machine learning model, and these are tailored to look for different kinds of intersectional and also geographic characteristics for their context, and then finally delivers to the activists or civil society organizations, the list of the most relevant results. So the idea here being to reduce the amount of irrelevant results, because many groups have to go through many irrelevant results that are stories of horrible violence that they have to read and determine that these are not useful. So that's the idea with the email alerts tool. And so the way that this relates back to the data feminism principles is around this idea of embracing pluralism. So thinking about sort of who is involved in the design of data-driven systems, in the design of machine learning models. And so embracing pluralism means thinking that the highest quality knowledge doesn't necessarily come from one genius designer. It doesn't necessarily come from one data scientist who's just a wizard or something, but it actually comes from synthesizing multiple perspectives with priority given to local, indigenous, and experiential ways of knowing. I'm just seeing there's some scribbling on my slide. Let me see. Does that take it away? Oh. Is there any way we can? Can I reach that? Oh, good. There we go. There we go. Okay. Thank you. So this is sort of one of the things we have to think about. Like, what does a participatory process for data science look like? And this is relatively unexplored territory for data science, right? But there are many fields that we can draw from here. So there's a long body of literature on participatory design. In urban planning, we actually have, kind of long-standing models of partnership and participation, not always working perfectly, but, many kind of experiments and explorations and so on. And one of the things, but one of the things that happens, right, when we're talking about participation in data science is, often we're building systems that are going to be used by, say, hundreds, maybe thousands of people. Often we're building systems at scale. We can't necessarily bring every single person to the table, right? So whose voices do we prioritize? And here, feminist thinkers have a really clear answer to that question. So following the work of folks like Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, Shawen Bardzel, a feminist design perspective takes power into account and centers the experiences of the people at the edges and the margins first and foremost. And so thinking about how do we make design decisions from the outside in. And so that's what this sort of pretend histogram represents here. A lot of times those of us who are designing systems are kind of looking at, well, let's design it for like the 80% of people or so who fall into this kind of like middle range. These often are the easiest people to reach. And then we build a system that kind of works for them. And then folks over here and over here, when they're left out, it's too difficult, too expensive, and so on. However, feminist design would kind of do the opposite of that and would say, actually, we're going to work with the folks that are over here and over here in a way that takes power into account and centers the experiences of those on the margins. And this is very in line with the Design Justice Network, who says we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. So these are the folks whose perspective should be centered and who should ideally be participating in the leadership of the work in the first place. Okay, I'm going to try to go a little faster here. Okay, a couple last principles to talk about here. So another major idea that comes from feminism relates to more conceptual structures of power, and specifically binary structures that are defined by a hard distinction between two groups. So here the distinction between the idea of man and woman is the obvious reference point. That is the gender binary. And this binary, feminist, there's so much feminist work on the gender binary. And often where this work is coming from is critiquing it as, first of all, it's an unequal hierarchy, because in fact, it's not like there's man and woman, right? It's actually like there's man and woman. So it's actually hiding a hierarchy. So binaries often hide hierarchies. And then secondly, feminists would say, in fact, it's wrong, right? Because there aren't two genders. So empirically speaking, there are more than two genders. So that's another reason why we should basically be suspicious of binaries when we come across them. So one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take this critique of the gender binary and use it to say, well, if the gender binary is actually a hierarchy, and if the gender binary is actually empirically wrong, then what other binaries that we encounter in the world are also morally and empirically flawed structures? And so these are things that, if we can think about binaries, these are things like nature and culture, or subject and object, or the one that this next example takes up, this artificial distinction between reason and emotion. So in an Anglo-Western context, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. We see this play out in data and in data visualization in particular. So best practices for data visualization often involve a kind of clean design, a minimalist aesthetic, a sort of just the facts kind of approach. But in the chapter that's about elevating emotion and embodiment, we say, why? Why are these our best practices? Especially when research shows that we interpret these aesthetic choices just as emotionally. So we tend to believe these kind of charts are more truthful than they actually are when they use conventions like two-dimensional viewpoints, clean layouts, and so on and so forth. And so in this chapter, we talk about visualizations that deliberately leverage emotion. So like, what are the affordances of actually embracing emotion when we're talking about communicating with data? And we use this example here. So what you're looking at are actually screenshots of an animated visualization that you can look at if you go to the URL that's mentioned here. So this is the number of gun-related deaths in the US in 2018. Each person killed by a gun is represented as a single arc in this visualization. And it's animated, so these are traced. The arcs are traced on the screen one by one, and they start out slow, and then they get faster and faster. And then they produce this kind of web image that you see here. And that's the point. So it goes on for a very long time because of this kind of it's counting, basically. And it produces this really interesting sort of speculative statistic here. So at the end, as it's tracing its lines, we see how many people have been killed in gun violence. And then it produces this statistic, which is represented by this gray area here. So when a person's life is cut short by gun violence, their arc turns from orange to gray. So everything under here represents the time that those people would have lived, the number of years they would have lived if their lives had not been cut short. And so they, sort of posit this as years that were stolen from people. It's a kind of very deliberate, sort of emotional, grief-oriented, loss-oriented frame on this data visualization. So methodologically, it's very statistically sound. The data are from a national crime data set. The projected lifespans are computed using lifespan estimates from the WHO. But when this visualization first came out, it was viewed with suspicion by the visualization community because one of its primary objectives was to move us, was to make us feel something. And a feminist approach here would actually say this is not a problem at all, that it made us feel things. And in fact, it's a more compelling visualization because it blends reason with emotion. So the goal here wouldn't be to say that like all visualizations, we should run out and make them super emotional or something like that. And obviously there are clear ways that emotion can be used to manipulate people. But what happens, we would ask, when you kind of open the door to letting emotion back in as a valid, ethical way of understanding, learning, and remembering, especially with data. Okay, so wrapping up, really the final point I want to make here is that I think is probably obvious from all of these examples, but it's that data feminism really insists on an expanded definition of data visualization and of data science more generally. You can see that with a lot of the examples that we surface in the book. They're not only from the realms of, say, academic data science or corporate data science. They're from many other worlds. And so the data science that we describe is not defined by the size of the data sets. It's not defined by the credentials of the people undertaking the work. These are concerns that are continually used to exclude women and people of color from the field, as well as to exclude work whose contribution is socio-technical rather than purely technical. But then once we expand our definition of data science, and if what we're interested in is this intersection of data science and justice, then we can clearly see that some of the most exciting work in data science today is actually being undertaken by artists, by journalists, by humanists, by community organizers, activists, librarians, and so on. Some of this work does look like traditional data science. So like work that you see here, this paper on human reporting bias, super interesting research on bias and natural language processing, shows up in a more conventional form. But next to her work, that's work by Margaret Mitchell and her team. Next to her work as an interactive AI sculpture by the artist Stephanie Dinkins, which was you can actually walk up to the sculpture and chat with it. It's like an AI chat bot in a physical form. And it was trained on this intergenerational dialogue of women in Stephanie's family. So Black women, like 4 generations of Black women. And so it will answer you sort of as an intergenerational member of Stephanie's family. And then here on the right, we have this really inventive data journalism by The Pudding, which looks at gender bias in Hollywood screenplays. And then down here, we have work by a group called Data Therapy, where they work with community-based organizations to create what they call data murals based on analyzing the community group's data work. Oops. So we have hundreds of examples like this in the book, and we selected these to illustrate our points, to inspire people to action. Because on the one hand, while we recognize that data is at the root of so many problems today, and certainly there's been tons more work since data feminism came out, kind of reporting out about sort of harmful cases of data-driven harms, algorithmic harms, and so on. Lauren and I also believe that using data can be part of the solution to addressing structural inequality. So thank you so much. Here's 1,000 ways to be in touch with us. We always welcome hearing from people. And then we actually did we made data feminism infographics, which you can see here because we for some reason we're invited to put data feminism in a number of artistic exhibitions. And so there's not really a great way to exhibit a book. So we worked with a designer named Marcia Diaz to create these infographics of the data feminism principles, which you can download those for free on our website. So thank you, and really looking forward to talking further and to any questions and comments. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's always tough in this virtual format, but at least from me, and I'm sure from many of us, we really appreciate you taking a huge body of work that you did in your book, but that's also drawing on obviously a large intellectual history of many, many years, and condensing it to give us at least a peek into some really important ideas. And I know that for our audience, obviously you weren't talking about learning data, but I hope people were able to make the bridge, and that's certainly what we'll talk about in the Q&A session, because at least for me, if you just add the phrase, what does this mean for learning analytics data, the questions of missing data, the power relationships in who's decided what data exists, because we often are working, we collect our own data sometimes, but we're also working with found data. So I hope people are trying to make those connections. And as you're making those connections, if you have questions for Catherine, Nicole put the link to HOVA in the chat. Obviously, we have Catherine here as an expert on the issues of data feminism and data science and power. Her background is not fully in education, but we're hoping to have a conversation that helps us to illustrate that space a little more. So we do have a couple questions to get started with. Let me just pull them up. So the first question, I'm just going to read it verbatim. This is from Mutlu. Great talk. Many thanks, Catherine. In our data science work, like and unlike constructs often become commensurate to detect similarities and differences with computational approaches, for example, clustering, classification, etc. What is your take on the use of these kind of approaches in education when many of the characteristics we're actually interested in are indeed uncontainable? For example, the gender one that you mentioned.
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's one of these things that I struggle with as myself, a data person. So many of our methods for working with data, working with data is to group, is to classify, is to reduce the world in some way, and that's how it is. You know what I mean? Like that is the work. It's like we will never achieve some kind of like perfect one-to-one representation, and I struggle with this in particular with concepts related to gender, race, and so on, because there's ways in which, gender itself is a kind of technology, even not even talking about how we like group and classify, is a kind of like dominating, disciplining kind of technology. It is a social construct, as is race is a social construct. And so what does it mean when we sort of like reify these social constructs, when we then put them in these data sets? And so I think for me, and again, especially if we're thinking about like how do we use data to look towards this more emancipatory, liberatory sort of data for equity, data for justice framing, it really looks at how can we not just think about characteristics of identity like gender, race, class, etc., as kind of additional sort of variables or columns, but how can we frame our work around interrogating sexism, racism, classism, are like these structural forces that show up. And that's where I think, data can be much more revealing of these sort of structural forces. Because what we risk when we're just like, all the people marked as girls over here are doing this way, and the people marked as men over here are doing this way, or whatever. We risk doing this sort of very essentializing thing and explaining something with gender, right? Which itself is this like really slippery thing, rather than saying, taking a couple steps back and reframing our work from a theoretical framework grounded in the idea that sexism, racism, colonialism, these forces are real, and we can use data to interrogate those forces. So I think kind of like zooming out of that like individual variable level and back. And then the other thing I'll say about sort of clustering and grouping and things like this, it's sort of like that participatory design slide that I showed, where it was kind of saying to look at the margins. This is the other, I would say, risk of using data-driven methods when we're talking about aggregation, the quantification and aggregation of populations, is because in particular smaller populations are going to always be marginalized within those models. So there will be, when we're talking about like numerically smaller populations, like say Native Americans or trans and non-binary students or something, these are groups whose needs are always going to be marginalized in a larger scale data set. And so I think at some level, if we want to use data for equity, we need to think about how do we recenter the data on the needs of those groups who we are going to be marginalizing. Not to say that we don't want a population level study, let's say of students in the school district or something like this, right? But how do we think about who's going to be numerically kind of smaller groups, and not just on kind of one axis too, but like thinking about, well, like what about when race and gender identity combine, or what about when class position and immigrant status combine, and how do we think about the needs of those specific groups? And these are things that if we are just kind of not not aware as we go in, we can say, well, the data is so good, data analysis is so good at telling us about majority patterns in like a kind of quantitative way. But when in fact, a lot of what we need to do from an equity standpoint is look at minoritized patterns, is look at outliers, is look at people who are kind of pushed to the outside of these systems.
Thank you, Catherine. That actually dovetails nicely. There's some questions flowing in right now, and there's one about outliers, so I'm going to pull that one up since you kind of were going in that direction. So Sarah asks, I appreciate your point. Nope, sorry, that's the wrong question. Let me switch. Here we go. Sorry, this is from Vile. What are your thoughts about statistical outliers? I assume this is a contextual thing, but should we always think twice or more when we make decisions to label data points as just outliers? Are those places we should be putting more attention? Obviously, that goes against a lot of what we're doing when we're working with large data sets. So how do you maybe operationalize that idea you were just talking about in a manageable way?
Totally. Yeah. No, I would say, in fact, I wrote an essay about outliers. So I'll try to find that link and I'll share it in the Q&A later. But precisely for this reason of thinking about how outliers could be, the way that I think about this is like outliers could be, they could be just errors, right? If we're talking about data, a lot of times data, outliers are just errors. Like mislabeled or miscollected or something like this. But at other times, outliers can be really interesting places to dig into more. And so I often think about this as a place where combining quantitative and qualitative analysis can be really powerful, where it's like, if you see this kind of pattern going on outside or like these kind of outlier values, thinking about, well, like, how do we understand that more? And how do we go in and actually understand what's like at the root of those things? And I would actually characterize this as a kind of mindset, like a outlier kind of style of thought. And I'll give an example just from the project that I'm working on right now, of how I've tried to implement that. So the main concept of the project, or the main groups that we're interviewing in that activist counter data project, are monitoring feminicide, this idea of gender-related violence. And yet, within that kind of universe of feminicide, there are groups that are highly marginalized even within that. So here, like groups like Indigenous women, missing and murdered Indigenous women, victims of violence who are trans, LGBTQ, and so on. And so one of the things that like from a population standpoint, small, in relation to this larger universe of women that are suffering from violence. And yet, really interesting and really distinct different patterns of violence that are really important to understand because of these intersectional forms of domination that they're subject to. And so one of the things that we've been doing is to interview those groups who monitor kind of more specific forms of gendered and racialized violence to understand what their specific needs are and whether the tools that we're developing may work for them. And in fact, one of the things we learned, the first tool we developed for those email alerts did not work for groups that were working to monitor missing and murdered Indigenous women, as well as Black women killed in police violence. And so we've continued to work with them to develop models that work in that sense. And so that's kind of what I mean by outlier thinking, is because the outliers actually are indicative potentially of these intersectional forms of domination that are happening, but they're happening to like a smaller subgroup that sits at that intersection. And that's extremely important to understand because, it's almost like the Combahee River Collective, I go by their manifesto a lot. They talk about how if Black women were free, we would all be free because it would necessitate the destruction of all forms of domination. And so thinking about like actually the path to liberation for all of us is through liberation for those of us who are at those intersections, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it reminds me of quotes saying, if not everyone is free, we're all not free. And so that we need to look at all of the edges. We're we're basically at the end of the session, but I'm going to throw one last question in because it combines a couple. I know that a lot of people might be sort of nodding along and there's some questions saying, yes, this sounds important and powerful, but how do we go about doing it in practice? And how do we go doing it in practice in our learning context? And there's a question that came up that I think it's something you're familiar enough with that you might be able to speak to. And the question is the one I started earlier from Sarah, which says, I appreciate your point about the aura of objectivity in data visualizations. Student evaluations of teaching have a similar problem that despite many studies showing their inherent bias, we persist in using them for career-making decisions, such as promotion and tenure. How do we challenge power in that context? Like, it's a very concrete example, and I think it might give us a chance to start to think about what does this look like in our world.
Yeah. No, that's a great example. Yeah. One of the things I think about is, especially with data communication, is thinking about ways that we can undo some of that aura of objectivity without without saying this is all a bunch of junk or whatever, right? Like, I think there's like a lot of fine lines between like, let's completely throw this away, and there's ways that this might be permeated by structural bias. And so I think about this in relationship, for example, to a decision that Lauren and I made in the book, where we wanted to feature some data visualizations because we felt that it was important work that was looking at gender bias. However, it was work that only looked at the gender bias. It had like this like very binary approach of like showing men here and women here, like wage gap and stuff like this. And so, inadvertently, that kind of work reifies the idea that the gender binary is real and there's only two genders and so on. And so here I would say like the idea of like using student evaluations in this non-critical way reifies this idea that student evaluations are a valid and representative and unbiased way to judge teacher performance or something like that. And the decision we made in the book was that we decided to, every time there was a thing that we reproduced or a study that we talked about that did the gender binary, we made sure in the caption or in the narrative of the text to say, this study did not collect non-binary data, or this, we had a sort of very transparent sort of caveat there, trying to be very clear about this idea that this is saying one thing, we can take it for face value on that specific thing, but here's the way that it itself is flawed. And so I can think of similar strategies for using student evaluations. I don't know like what the sort of manner of presentation is, but in prompting people to be critical, presenting people maybe with some information about like, here are the ways in which student evaluations can be quite biased along these axes of like race or gender or whatever it might be. There's certainly lots of good work on that. And so being more transparent about that, and also transparent about like what, if you as the system designer then like kind of using those as an input into some other thing, making sure it's really clear that it's like transparent about how that input was used and to calculate what metric or indicator or something like that. And or even adjust. I mean, like maybe based on research, if women are consistently ranked lower than men, then maybe you say, well, that's a kind of error point. So actually this person should have like +2 or whatever, So I think there's like ways that you can incorporate some of that good work about bias and then maybe like insert that as well. So yeah, those would be some top of the head ideas.
Wonderful. Those are some pretty great and concrete top of the head ideas to give us plenty to think about. With that, I'm going to close the session. Thank you again, Catherine, for a great talk and a great discussion. We now have a half an hour break. For those of you who are interested to chat more with Catherine, we're going to have a session starting at in a half an hour at X30, where X is wherever you are in the world. I believe it's going to be in this exact same Zoom room, and so I'm actually going to leave the room open, though I and many of us are going to disappear, but you can come in as you wish. And we'll start up again in 24 minutes. We'll have a half an hour chat with Catherine. We will continue the questions that didn't get answered now, but there will be a new Whova session where you can ask new questions, and then we'll follow that with 2 papers, and there's also some other great parallel sessions. Have a wonderful day at the conference, everyone.